So, my lecture this evening is going to be about the conditions under which we should welcome robots into our moral communities. Now, whenever I talk about this topic, I'm struck by how much my academic career has come to depend upon the reflections from my idle childhood. Like many others, I was obsessed with science fiction when I was younger, and in particular with the representation of robots in science fiction. I had two favorite fictional robots. The first was R2-D2 from the original Star Wars trilogy, and the second was Commander Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. Now, I liked R2-D2 because of his personality, courageous, playful, and disdainful of authority, and I liked Data because the writers of Star Trek used him as a vehicle for exploring some important philosophical questions. In fact, I have to confess that Data has had an outsized influence on my philosophical imagination, and has indeed featured in several of my academic papers. And part of the reason for this is purely practical. When I was growing up, we didn't have many options to choose from when it came to television. We had to make do with what was available, and as luck would have it, Star Trek The Next Generation was on every day when I came home from school. As a result, I think I must have watched each episode of its original 7-season run multiple times. Now, one episode in particular always stuck with me. It was called The Measure of a Man, and in it, a scientist from the Federation visits the Starship Enterprise because he wants to take Data back to his lab to study him. Data, you see, is a sophisticated, human-like android. He was created by a lone scientific genius under somewhat dubious conditions, and the Federation scientist wants to take Data apart and see how he works with a view to building others like him. Data, unsurprisingly, objects to this. He argues that he is not just a machine or a piece of property that can be traded and disassembled to suit the whims of human beings. He has his own independent moral standing or status, and he deserves to be treated with dignity. But how does Data prove his case? In the episode, a trial ensues and evidence is given on both sides. The prosecution argue that Data is clearly just a piece of property. He was created, not born. He doesn't think or see the world in the same way as a human being. He even has an off switch. Data counters this by giving evidence of the rich relationships he has formed with his fellow crew members, and by eliciting testimony from them regarding his behaviors and his interactions. Ultimately, he wins the case. The court accepts that he has moral standing. Now, we can certainly regret the impact that science fiction of this sort has had on the philosophical debate about robots. As David Gunkel observes in his 2018 book, Robot Rights, science fiction, already and well in advance of actual engineering practice, has established expectations for what a robot is or can be. Even before engineers have sought to develop working prototypes, artists and filmmakers have imagined what robots do or can do, what configurations they might take, and what problems they could produce for human individuals and communities. He continues, noting that this is a potential liability because science fiction, it is argued, often produces unrealistic expectations for and irrational fears about robots that are not grounded in or informed by actual science. Now, I certainly want to heed this warning, but nevertheless, I think the approach taken by the Next Generation writers in the episode Measure of a Man is actually fundamentally correct. Even if we cannot currently create a being like Data, and even if the speculation is well in advance of the science, they still give us the correct guide to resolving the philosophical question of when to welcome robots into our moral community. Or that, at any rate, is what I'm going to argue in the remainder of this lecture. Now, before I get into my own argument, let me just say something about the current lay of the land when it comes to this issue, because it's not that pretty. Some of you might be familiar with the famous study by the social psychologist Muzaffar Sherif. It was done in the early 1950s at a summer camp in Robbers Cave, Oklahoma, in the United States. Suffice to say, it is one of those studies that wouldn't get ethics approval nowadays. Sherif and his colleagues were interested in tribalism and conflict. They wanted to see how easy it would be to get two groups of 11-year-old boys to divide into separate tribes and to go to war with one another. It turned out to be surprisingly easy. By arbitrarily separating the boys into two groups, by giving them a nominal group identity, the Rattlers versus the Eagles, and putting them into competition with each other, Sharif and his research assistants sowed the seeds for bitter and repeated conflict. Now, this study has become a classic. It's repeatedly cited as evidence of how easy it is for humans to get trapped in intransigent group conflicts. And I mention it here because, unfortunately, it seems to capture what has happened with the debate about the potential moral standing of robots. The disputants have settled into two reasonably clearly defined tribes. There are those that are anti the idea, and those that are pro the idea. And the tribes sometimes get into heated arguments with one another, particularly on Twitter, which is admittedly not the best medium for rational debate. Now, those that are anti the idea would include, I think, Noel Sharkey, Amanda Sharkey, Deborah Johnson, Amy Van Winsberg, and indeed the most recent lecturer in this series, Joanna Bryson. They cite a variety of reasons for their opposition. The Sharkeys, I suspect, think the whole debate is slightly ridiculous, because current robots clearly lack the capacity for moral standing, and indeed, debating their moral standing just distracts us from the important issues in robot ethics, namely stopping the creation and use of robots that are harmful to human well-being. Deborah Johnson, I think, would argue that robots can never experience pain or suffering, and as a result can never have moral status or standing. Van Winsberg and Bryson are maybe a little bit different and lean more heavily on the idea that even if it were possible to create robots with moral standing, a possibility that Bryson is willing to concede, it would be a very bad idea to do so because it would cause considerable moral and legal disruption. Those that are more on the pro side would include people like Kate Darling, Mark Kuckelberg, David Gunkel, Erica Neely, and Daniel Estrada. Again, they cite a variety of reasons for their views. Darling is probably the weakest of those on the pro side. She focuses on humans and thinks that even if robots themselves lack moral standing, we should treat them as if they had moral standing, because that would be better for us and how we treat one another. Kuckelberg and Gunkel are a little bit more provocative, arguing that when settling questions of moral standing, we should focus less on the intrinsic capacities of robots and more on how we relate to them. If those relations are thick and meaningful, then maybe the robots should have moral standing. Erica Neely proceeds from a principle of moral precaution, arguing that even if we were unsure of the moral standing of robots, we should err on the side of over-inclusivity rather than under-inclusivity when it comes to this issue. Estrada, then, is probably the polar opposite of Bryson and Van Winsberg. He welcomes the moral and legal disruption that embracing robots would entail because it would break the grip of humanism on our ethical codes. I should also probably say something here about this evening's discussant, Sven. I had the good fortune of reading a manuscript of Sven's forthcoming book, Humans, Robots and Ethics, and it is, I have to say, an excellent and entertaining contribution to the field of robot ethics. And in it, Sven shares his own views about the moral standing issue, and I'm sure he'll explain them later on, but for the time being, I think I would tentatively place him somewhere near Kate Darling on this map. He thinks that we should be open to the idea of robot moral standing, but not because of what the robots themselves are, but because of what this will say about our interactions with others. And what of myself, then? Where do I fit in all of this? I think most people would classify me as belonging to the pro side. I have certainly argued in the past that we should be open to the idea that robots have moral standing, but I think I would actually just much rather to transcend this tribalistic framing of the debate. I'm not an advocate for the moral standing of robots, and I think many of the concerns raised by those on the anti-side are valid. Debating the moral standing of robots can, at times, seem ridiculous and a distraction from other important questions in robot ethics. Furthermore, accepting them into our moral communities will undoubtedly lead to some legal and moral disruption, although I would add here that not all disruption is a bad thing. That said, I do care about the principles we should use to decide questions of moral standing, and I think that those on the anti-side of the debate oftentimes use bad arguments to support their views. This is why, in the remainder of this lecture, I will defend a particular approach to settling the question of the moral standing of robots, and I'll do so in the hope that this can pave the way to a more fruitful and less tribalistic debate. In this sense, I hope to return to the true lesson of Sharif's famous experiment on tribalism. In her fascinating book, The Lost Boys, inside Muzaffar Sharif's Robbers Cave experiment, Gina Perry has revealed the hidden history behind Sharif's work. It turns out that Sharif tried to conduct the exact same experiment 1 year before Robbers Cave in Middle Grove, New York, and it didn't work out. No matter what he and the other experimenters did to encourage conflict, the boys at that summer camp refused to get sucked into it. But why was this? One suggestion is that at Middle Grove, Sharif didn't sort the boys into two arbitrary groups as soon as they arrived. They were given the chance to mingle and to get to know one another before being segregated. This initial intermingling may have inoculated them from tribalism. Perhaps we can do the same thing through careful philosophical dialogue. I certainly live in hope. Okay, so what then about the position that I want to defend? The position is something I call ethical behaviorism. Now, according to this view, the behavioral representations of another toward you are a sufficient, and oftentimes the best ground for determining their moral standing or status. To put it slightly differently, how an entity looks and acts is enough to determine its moral status. If it looks and acts like a duck, then you should treat it like you treat any other duck. Now, ethical behaviorism works through comparisons. If you are unsure about the moral status of a particular entity, and for present purposes let's just say that this is a robot, then you should compare its behaviors to that of another entity that has already agreed to have moral status. A human or an animal, say. If the robot is performatively equivalent to that other entity, then it too has moral status or standing. Or more precisely, if it is roughly performatively equivalent, then it has moral status, since no two entities are ever perfectly equivalent. If you compare two adult human beings, you'd no doubt spot some performative differences between them, but this wouldn't mean that any of them lacks moral standing as a result. Now, there is nothing novel in ethical behaviorism. It is, in effect, just a moral variation of the famous Turing test for machine intelligence, where Turing argued that we should assess intelligence on the basis of behavior. All I am arguing here is that we should determine moral standing on the basis of behavior. And I'm not the first to defend this view. Others have defended something quite similar to it, even if they haven't explicitly labeled it as such. Now, despite the lack of novelty, ethical behaviorism is easily misunderstood and frequently derided. So let me just clarify a couple of points. Ethical behaviorism is a practical and epistemic thesis about how we can settle questions of moral standing. It is not an abstract, metaphysical thesis about what it is that grounds moral standing. So, for example, someone could argue that the capacity to feel pain is what determines moral standing, and that this capacity in turn depends on a creature having a certain kind of mental apparatus. The ethical behaviorist can agree with all of that. They will just argue that the best evidence we have for determining whether an entity has the capacity to feel pain is going to be behavioral. Furthermore, ethical behaviorism is agnostic about the broader consequences of its comparative test. To say that one entity should have the same moral standing as another does not mean that both are entitled to a full set of legal and moral rights. That depends on other considerations. A goat, for example, could have moral standing, but that doesn't mean that it has the right to own property. This is important because when I'm arguing that we should apply this comparative approach to robots, I'm not thereby endorsing a broader claim that we should grant robots legal rights or to treat them like adult human beings. It all depends on the details of the comparative test. So what's the actual argument for ethical behaviorism? So I would say that the argument consists of three premises or propositions. The first premise is that the most popular criteria for moral status are dependent upon mental states or capacities. I'm thinking here about theories of moral status that focus on sentience, consciousness, having interests, being an agent, or being a person. The second premise or proposition is that the best evidence, and oftentimes in fact really the only evidence we have to show that somebody satisfies these criteria for moral status is behavioral. And the third premise then is that any alternative or alleged grounds for moral status, or any alternative criteria for determining moral status, either fail to trump or dislodge the behavioral criteria. The conclusion then is that ethical behaviorism is correct. Behavior provides a sufficient basis for settling questions of moral status. Now, I take it that the first premise of this argument is uncontroversial. Even if you think there are other grounds for moral status, I suspect you agree that an entity with sentience or consciousness or something has moral standing or status. The second premise is undoubtedly more controversial, but it is, I think, practically undeniable. It is a trite observation, but I'm going to make it anyway. We don't have direct access to one another's minds. I cannot crawl inside your head and see if you are really experiencing pain or suffering. The only thing I have to go on is how you behave and react to the world. This is true, by the way, even if I could scan your brain and see whether the pain-perceiving part of it lights up. The only basis we have for verifying the correlations between functional activity in the brain and mental states is ultimately behavioral. And what I mean here is that the only way to verify those correlations is to ask people in brain scanners what they are feeling. So all premise 2 is saying is that if the most popular theories of moral status are going to work in practice, it can only be because we see or we use behavioral evidence to guide their application. That brings us then to premise 3, the claim that all other criteria fail to dislodge the importance of this behavioral evidence. This is by far the most controversial one. Many people seem to passionately believe that there are other ways of determining moral status, and indeed that relying on behavioral evidence alone would be absurd. Consider, for example, these 2 recent Twitter comments on an article that I wrote about ethical behaviorism, particularly focusing on the analogy people sometimes draw between animals and robots. The first comment states that this is errant, behaviorist, materialist nonsense. Robots are inanimate, even if they imitate animal behavior. They don't want or care about anything. But you knock yourself out. Put your toaster in jail if it burns your toast. And the second comment here, if I give a hammer a friendly face, so some people feel emotionally attached to it, it still remains a tool. Hashtag anthropomorphic fallacy. Now these are strong critical statements, but they are not at all unusual. I encounter criticism of this kind quite frequently. But why? Why is it that people are so resistant to ethical behaviorism? Why do they think that there must be something else to how we determine moral status? Let me now just consider some of the most popular objections. Now, in a recent paper, I suggested that there are at least 7, and probably more depending on how you count, major objections to ethical behaviorism. I also argued that each of them was unpersuasive. Now, I don't have time to review all 7 here, but I will consider 4 of the more popular ones. And each of these objections should be understood as an attempt to argue that behavioral evidence by itself cannot suffice for settling questions of moral status. So the first objection. The first objection states that the ontology of an entity makes a difference to its moral standing. To adopt the Aristotelian language, we can say that the material cause of an entity, what it is made up of, matters more than behavior when it comes to questions of moral status. So, for example, someone could argue that robots lack moral standing because they are not biological creatures. They are not made from the same wet, organic components as human beings or animals. Even if they are performatively equivalent to human beings and animals, this ontological difference scuppers any claim they might have to moral standing. Now, I find this objection unpersuasive because it smacks to me of biological Mysterianism. Why exactly does being made of the right why exactly does being made of particular organic material make such a crucial difference? Consider the following thought experiment. Imagine if your spouse, the person that you live with every day, was suddenly revealed to be an alien from the Andromeda galaxy. Scientists conduct careful tests and determine that they are not a carbon-based life form. They are made from something different, perhaps silicon. Despite this, they still look and act in the exact same way as they always have. albeit now with some explaining to do. Would the fact that they are made of different stuff mean that they no longer warrant any moral status in your eyes? Surely not. Surely the behavioral evidence suggesting that they still care about you and still have the same mental capacities that you used to associate with moral standing would trump the new evidence you have regarding their ontology. Now, I know non-philosophers don't like thought experiments of this sort, finding them to be slightly ridiculous and far-fetched. Nevertheless, I do think they are vital in this context because they show us that behavior is really what's doing all the heavy lifting when it comes to assessing moral status. This is also, incidentally, why I think it's wrong to say that ethical behaviorism is a materialist view. Ethical behaviorism is completely agnostic as to the physical or non-physical instantiation of the mind. All that said, I am willing to make one major concession to the material cause objection. I am happy to concede that ontology might provide an alternative or independent ground for determining the moral status of an entity. Thus, for example, someone in a permanent coma might have moral standing because of what they are made of, and not because of what they can do. Still, all this really shows is that being made of the right stuff is an independent sufficient ground for moral standing, and not that it is a necessary ground for moral standing. The latter is what you would need to prove to undermine ethical behaviorism. So the second objection is that how an entity comes into existence makes a difference to its moral standing. To continue the Aristotelian theme, we can say that the efficient cause of existence is more important than the unfolding reality. This is an objection that the philosopher Michael Hauskeller hints at in his work. Now, Hauskeller doesn't focus on moral standing per se, but he does focus on when it is that we can be confident that another entity cares for us. He concedes that behavior seems like the most important thing. What else could caring really be apart from caring behavior? But then he resiles from this conclusion by arguing that how the being came into existence can undercut the behavioral evidence. So, for example, a robot might act as if it cares about you, but when you learn that the robot was created and manufactured by a team of humans to act as if it cares for you, then you have reason to doubt the sincerity of its behavior. Now, it could be that what Hauskeller is getting at here is that behavioral evidence often can be deceptive and misleading. If that's his concern, I'm going to deal with it in a moment. But it could also be that he's making a different point, and that he thinks that the mere fact that a robot was programmed and manufactured as opposed to being evolved and developed makes a crucial difference to moral standing. If that is what he is arguing, then it is hard to see why we should take it seriously. Again, imagine if your spouse told you that they were not conceived and raised in the normal human way. They were genetically engineered in a lab and then carefully trained and educated. Having learned this, would you take a new view of their moral standing? Surely not. Surely, once again, how they actually behave on an ongoing basis, and not how they came into existence, would be what really mattered. Furthermore, I would point out that if this is what Hauskeller is arguing, it would provide us with an unstable basis on which to make crucial judgments of moral standing. After all, the differences between humans and robots with respect to their efficient causes is starting to blur. Increasingly, robots are not being programmed and manufactured from the top down to follow specific rules. They are instead given learning algorithms and then trained on different data sets, with the process sometimes being explicitly modeled on evolution and childhood development. Similarly, humans are increasingly being designed and programmed from the top down through artificial reproduction, embryo selection, and, no doubt soon, genetic engineering. Now, you may well object to all this tinkering with the natural processes of human development and conception, but I think you would be hard-pressed to deny that a human that came into existence as a result of those processes lacks moral standing. So this efficient cause objection doesn't seem to work. Now, the third objection is that the purposes an entity serves makes a crucial difference to its moral standing. Now, this is actually an objection that Joanna Bryson has favored in some of her work. In several papers, she has argued that because robots will be designed by us to fulfill certain purposes on our behalf, i.e. because they'll be designed to serve us, and because they will also be owned and controlled by us in the process, they should not have moral standing. Now, to be fair, Bryson is more open to the possibility of robot moral standing than most, but she has said on several occasions that it is possible to create moral standing, robots that have moral standing. She just thinks that this should not happen because they will be owned and controlled by us and because they should be designed to serve our needs. Now, this can be a little bit difficult to understand, but I don't think there is anything in this that dislodges or upsets ethical behaviorism. For one thing, I find it hard to believe that the fact that an entity has been designed to fulfill a certain purpose should make a crucial difference to its moral standing. Again, suppose here in the future that human parents can genetically engineer their offspring to fulfill certain ends. For example, they can select genes that will guarantee, with the right training regimen, that their child will be a successful athlete. And this is actually not that dissimilar from what many parents try to do nowadays. Would this fact alone undermine the child's claim to moral standing? Surely not, and surely the same standard should apply to a robot. If a robot is performatively equivalent to another entity with moral standing, then the mere fact that it has been designed to fulfill a purpose should not affect that moral standing. Related to this, it's hard to see why the fact that we might own and control robots should make a crucial difference to their moral standing. If they satisfy the performative equivalence test. If anything, I think this inverts the proper order of moral justification. The fact that a robot looks and acts like another entity that we believe has moral standing should probably cause us to question our approach to ownership and control, and not vice versa. We once thought it was okay for humans to own and control other humans, but we were wrong to think this because it ignored the moral standing of those other humans. That said, I accept that there are some nuances here. Many people think that animals have some kind of moral standing. In other words, that we need to respect their welfare and well-being in what we do. But they don't think that it is consequently wrong to own them or attempt to control them. And the same approach might apply to robots if they are being compared to animals. This is one of the crucial points about ethical behaviorism. The ethical consequences of accepting that a robot is performatively equivalent to another entity with moral standing depends crucially on who or what that other entity is. The fourth objection, then, is that ethical behaviorism cannot work because it is too easy to be deceived by behavioral cues. A robot might look and act like it is in pain, but this could just be a clever trick used by its manufacturer to foster false sympathy. Now, this is probably the most important criticism of ethical behaviorism. It is what I think lurks behind the claim that ethical behaviorism is absurd, and also the deep-seated resistance to it. It is well known that humans have a tendency towards hasty anthropomorphism. That is to say, we tend to ascribe human-like qualities to features of our environment without proper justification. We anthropomorphize the weather, our computers, the trees and the plants, and so forth. It could be easy to hack this tendency towards hasty anthropomorphism. As social roboticists know, putting a pair of eyes on a robot can completely change how a human interacts with it, even if the robot cannot see anything. People worry, consequently, that ethical behaviorism is easily exploited by nefarious technology companies. Now, I don't find this objection persuasive either, but I certainly sympathize with the fear that motivates it. It is definitely true that behavior can be misleading and deceptive. For example, we are often misled by the behavior of our fellow human beings. To quote Shakespeare here, someone can smile and be a villain. But what is the significance of this fact when it comes to assessing moral status? To me, the significance is that it means we should be very careful when assessing the behavioral evidence that is used to support a claim of moral standing. We shouldn't extrapolate quickly from one behavior, say. So if a robot looks and acts like it is in pain, that might provide some warrant for thinking that it has moral status, but we should examine its full behavioral repertoire in more detail to confirm this. it might emerge that other behaviors are inconsistent with the hypothesis that it feels pain or suffering. The point here, however, is that we're always going to be using behavioral evidence to determine whether the initial behavioral evidence was deceptive or misleading. We are not going to be relying on some other kind of information. Thus, for example, I think it would be very wrong to conclude that a robot cannot feel pain, even though it performs it as if it does feel pain, simply because the manufacturer tells us that it was programmed to do this, or because some computer engineer can point to some lines of code that are responsible for this pain performance. That evidence, by itself, cannot undermine the behavioral evidence suggesting that a robot does feel pain. Think about it like this. Imagine if a biologist came to you and told you that evolution had programmed the pain response into humans in order to elicit sympathy from other humans. What's more, suppose a neuroscientist comes along and points to the exact circuit in the brain that is responsible for the human pain performance. I have no doubt that what they say will be true, but that wouldn't mean that the behavioral evidence suggesting that your fellow human beings are in pain can be ignored. And this last point is really the crucial bit. This is what is most distinctive about the perspective of ethical behaviorism. And the tendency to ignore it or skirt around it is why I think many people on the anti-side of the debate make bad arguments. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say in defense of ethical behaviorism. Let me conclude by addressing some of its implications and heading off some potential misunderstandings. First, let me re-emphasize that ethical behaviorism is about the principles we should apply when assessing the moral standing of robots. In defending it, I am not claiming that robots currently have moral standing, or indeed that they will ever have moral standing. I think this is possible, and indeed probable someday, but I could be wrong. The devil is always going to be in the detail of the behavioral tests that we apply, just as it is with the Turing test for intelligence. This means that those who think the debate about the moral standing of robots is a distraction from important issues in robot ethics may well be right on certain occasions. Second, let me just say that there is nothing in ethical behaviorism that suggests that we ought to create robots that cross the performative threshold to have moral status. It could be, for example, as people like Bryson and Van Winsberg argue, that this is a very bad idea, that it will be too disruptive of existing moral and legal norms. What ethical behaviorism does suggest, however, is that there is an ethical weight to the decision to create human-like or animal-like robots that may often be underappreciated by robot manufacturers. Third, acknowledging that there are risks to creating robots with moral standing, I would also just like to point out that there are potential benefits to it too. And indeed, ethical behaviorism can help to reveal a value to the relationships we have with robots that is otherwise hidden. If I'm right, then robots can be genuine objects of moral affection, of friendship and love, and under the right conditions. In other words, just as there are ethical risks to creating human-like or animal-like robots, there are also ethical rewards, and I think these tend to be ignored in the current debate or else ridiculed or sidelined. Fourth, and related to this previous point, the performative threshold that robots have to cross in order to unlock the different kinds of value might vary quite a bit. So, for example, the performative threshold needed to attain some basic moral standing might be quite low. But the performative threshold that a robot needs to cross in order to convince us that it is our friend, for example, might be substantially higher. Now, these are topics that I have explored in much greater detail in some of my other papers, and they're also topics that Sven has explored at considerable length. Indeed, several chapters of his forthcoming book are dedicated to them. So on that note, it's probably time for me to shut up and hand over to him and see what he has to say about all of this. Thank you for your attention.